So my job today, welcome everybody. I guess you're getting close to the end of your course. Has anybody finished their final project and you're just waiting to deliver it?
They're laughing.
Well, congratulations, because you'll now have at least some weeks to really massage that finished product. But anyway, it's. If there is still some work ahead of you, I think, again, the key thing is to figure out what's the question you want to ask about your topic, and then your presentation, I think, can hopefully set up the question and answer it, whatever it might be. So I'm Gary Goldsand, a clinical ethicist, and assist Dr. Solis in teaching this course. And I think my task today was to help facilitate discussion about Dr. White's presentation. So I thought the easiest way to do that might be to go over some of his slides, just to remind you of some of the things he said, which I think have a lot in common with what I've been hoping to discuss, which is some version of what does all of this mean in the larger scheme of things as you come into awareness of not only the incredibly, or likely to be incredibly useful future technologies, which is one angle of the course. But then I think the other is to really try to contemplate the singularity and what that might mean. And it's pretty clear in Dr. White's overview that it isn't intended to be a clear concept. So I think I'll just try I guess to recall some of the things he says as I go through these pictures. Feel free to jump in at any moment if there's something you'd like to add. And then there are parts where we'll stop and have discussion. There are at least a few slides where he asks a direct question. And I think we can certainly take up his invitation to have a discussion at that point. So just, you can see this behind me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, going over the singularity, what is it? The moment when technological change becomes so rapid and profound, it represents a rupture in the fabric of human history. And at some point he speaks later that, what does even that word rupture mean? Is it a violent tearing, or is it, if we're going to talk about a rupture in history, how big and revolutionary event does that have to be? Have we had any ruptures before? Things like the Industrial Revolution, or the founding of a major religion, things that really seemed to lead to substantial changes in the way people think and the way people behave. So, he then uses this image. The singularity, the word, is taken from our descriptions and understandings of a black hole. Again, something that we don't fully understand, but we worry that it has this concept of being this entity in the universe that sucks in all energy, and because of its incredible mass, for gravitational or other reasons, doesn't let any energy out. So almost by definition, as you're getting sucked into it, there's never any way of knowing what's on the other side, and that's one of the problems. So I think it's worth noting at this point that language is metaphorical. So when we say singularity, it isn't intended to mean exactly the same thing as a black hole. It's intended, again, to imagine what might happen beyond that point of no return. In this case being some sort of union or understanding between good old-fashioned human beings and the advanced technology that we think we're on the cusp of creating because of exponentially growing computing power. So just a few other words. I've been studying religion for 35 years, and words like transcend and transcendence are another example of something that a little bit slippery. What exactly do we mean by transcend? So I think it's helpful when Dr. White just spends a little time, what does he mean by that? What does it mean to transcend biology, which is the title of his talk. So something to go up above and beyond, exceed, transcend the limits of thought. I think in some ways it means to move beyond our conception of what human life is, in some way that includes those concepts of above and beyond. And so the third one, it's often, the transcendent has often been referred, a word that is used to refer to the divine or God or something, that which transcends the normal world and by implication, maybe goes beyond the physical laws of the universe or the laws of physics. So transcendent, meaning above and beyond. And the difference in certain theological circles, might be, or the opposite of transcendence might be an immanent God, God that is close and touchable. So again, just to get those terms straight. He quickly talks about Descartes, so for those of you who haven't had a chance to do a bunch of philosophy, the famous line of Descartes is his recognition of, he says, "I think, therefore I am." And it's his way of answering the question, how do I even know that human life isn't just some big illusion? And in his discussion, he ends up realizing that he is a living, thinking being, and whatever anybody else says, he senses that. And so it becomes this beginning of his philosophy that he knows that he's an independent entity. And so it does say something about what is it to be an independent entity and to be sentient and self-aware. And so that's why he brings in Descartes, the famous philosopher. And so then he's doing a fair bit of reflection on, well, what does it mean to have a body? He states very clearly, or multiple times, that while he appears to be bashing the idea of the body, in some ways, he still very much enjoys his body and thinks that it may well be essential to human life, and it's part of his musings. He shares this this quote: "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And I think this is very much related to the slide that I had about narrative ethics. What does it mean? What are the stories that we adopt, that we use to order our lives? Both the individual stories as well as the societal stories. So this is, I think, the same idea. He's quoting Joan Didion. "We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience." So none of you has ever actually used that word in conversation, have you? Well, you can start now, although I think it's a bit 19th century if you pull it out. So then he refers to the his own self-reflection. That what does he as a surgeon do? I think he really does a nice job of I think describing his relationship with the bodies that come before him. That he's very much the mechanic. Says he does a version of rewiring or replumbing, replacing broken parts, cutting bad parts out, dealing with blockages, releasing evil humors, stopping leaks, upgrades to the basic model, and he gives examples of each of those. But then really highlights the brain in some ways, that it seems that our body is filled with replaceable parts except for that one. And invites us to think, well, what does that mean? The downside of biology, it definitely describes illness and injury and failures of all types as evidence that the body could probably be improved upon. It's unreliable, fragile, can't back it up, can't restore it, one use, limited life, messy, bodily fluids and such. Making new units is fun but slow. Just talking about reproduction. Limited processor speeds, limited capacity for upgrades. It's sort of noteworthy when there's this assumption that we human beings have evolved for a few 100,000 years or something, that it's pretty well recognized that the brains and bodies that we currently have aren't the product of recent evolution. We've more or less had these tools for at least tens of thousands of years, we would think. And then, so he says several times that evolutionarily speaking, we are made to hunt and kill and maybe take care of feeding ourselves, whether that's I guess not only killing, also gathering vegetables. So that's really what we have evolved to be able to do. So the very idea that we're sitting here basically idle with our eyes on screens, he suggests that is not, that we're not primed in an evolutionary way to do those activities. We do them anyway. Then he talks about alternatives to the body, so what might they be, and then he gives a series of possibilities. That we need to understand the biology at a basic level and a molecular level, what's going on, or to find something better than biology, by which he means transcend. So I think this fundamental question is in what way can we possibly think of future human existence being without our physical body? Is there any way that you can get your mind around it? And so, and this is where we'll be inviting you to discuss shortly. After a few months of being bombarded with these ideas, where might you be at in terms of what you make of it so far? And, so then he talks about 5 options. We can transcend our biology by controlling the body better, by augmenting the body, adding parts that work better, or linking up with them, backing up the body. And so whenever I hear this, it's this, I guess the obvious metaphor are our computers that we occasionally back up, and that if you lose it or drop it or something, your life will return to that point and you can build from there. So this very idea that our brain would be something that we could fully back up, so that if it were damaged today or something that we could pick up from our last. And I know that my first thought is it perhaps an oversimplification to think that all of the relevant data that's in our brains could be transferred to a computer? Again, I think exponential growth in computing power would suggest that a few more notches up the exponential curve, and our computers really will be getting closer to the processing power of our brains. So it's certainly not inconceivable to think that that might be possible. I know I'm a bit of a skeptic because I think that while the metaphor of brain and its interactions and computing power is an appropriate one, I think that there might be a whole bunch of things going on within the brain that we simply don't understand, and the idea that we could download it is far-fetched. But again, I'm open to being wrong about that. Transcend by running on another substrate, by which I think he means if you really can download all that's important in the brain, you don't necessarily need a human body with which to express it. It might be some other type of body or physical entity. Or the possibility that we could exist without physical being, that if it really is possible to upload our consciousness and we try to think as far beyond the box as we can, is it conceivable that we might actually have a real existence without the need for a physical body? And that's where the word transcendent really comes in. And what might we imagine by this? do we imagine it would be an individual identity, or would it be a merger with some collective identity? And what can we possibly say about that? And then towards the end of the first talk, he gives us these couple slides, where he's trying to imagine what might life be like in if any of these things take off in a substantial way. That we wouldn't have a need for basic physical things, eating, sleeping, voiding, that we probably wouldn't have to work, and that's based on the assumption that the goods and services and food that we need to survive are so easily produced that they're just readily available. The idea that war and poverty are things of the past, no need to reproduce, and that where I think he's imagining super long lives or permanent lives, which would quite understandably change our sense of whether we need to reproduce. And when we had the discussion a couple months ago about extending lifespans and looking at the problem of overpopulation, maybe that would be dealt with by a curbing of the desire to reproduce or something. No time pressure. He says that you could just follow your heart if you want to study the dynamics of lawn bowling in France for 40 years. You can do so. You can become highly specialized, and then we'll know all about lawn bowling in France. No separation. Again, so much of this does come down to the most basic questions of what is human life and what are we doing here. I think I've described it in some ways, or I've hypothesized that maybe the main thing we're trying to do in our human lives is recognize our radical individuality, that each one of us is boxed inside this machine called our bodies, and in some way or other we spend our lives trying to connect with other people in some way. As an individual that becomes part of a whole, and surely the meaning of life has something to do with that. That's, and I'm just trying to think of people who are traditionally religious, people who have rejected that. One thing you can describe everyone as doing is finding some way to reach out and connect with the other. And it seems to be that we want to do that, whether it's other human entities or non-human, or the idea of a transcendent being. And then he asks, what would it mean if we moved to something better than biology, something reliable and upgradable, with a low rate of breakdown and a backup function? Basically, if we could overcome the limitations of our fragile bodies, what might it mean? And then he asks these questions, and so I'll throw them out and then I'll pause, just because if you guys want to initiate any conversation based on this first part, we'll do so. So are you still you if your body changes? What do you imagine? And again, this is where I think you really have to I think be creative in the way that you imagine this. We already know that a clone, that two identical twins are clones of each other, but clearly they are different people. And so for you to think that the uploaded version, or the version where your material is the map and then they make another entity, would that really be you? Or would it be more like your identical twin? Somebody who shares your building blocks, but is an individual entity. And again, that's not supposed to be an easy question to answer. And then questions for you. Would you want to leave your body behind? And what happens to those who don't want to necessarily take part in this meeting? So let me just break there and say, any of you either want to comment on anything that I related so far, or take a stab at one of these questions. Are you still you?
I'll take a stab at it.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're still you if your body changes. If people get people go to war, they come back with amputations and stuff, they're still them. You're not perhaps the whole you. As you grow, you mature and you change, right? So there's aspects that change. And, because people are dynamic, I think you're still you because it just represents another part or change in your life, essentially.
I mean, I guess in some ways, it depends on how thorough is this backup. That's where, we don't necessarily know. Does it have all the information, including your own memory of everything you've ever felt or seen? Because I think such details would change whether you think it's you or not.
So when you back yourself up, would your original body be like destroyed?
I think the idea is that your brain and everything that is recorded would be used in some other entity. I don't know what happens with the
Okay.
original.
So in that case, I think at the initial point where you back yourself up, providing that every sort of information in your brain can be transferred over, I think you would be the same person. But I think over time, if you have these two separate entities kind of go their own separate ways and have different experiences, I think over time there will be a path that diverges. You will have two separate entities.
Mhm. So basically, the second one would start out from where the first one left off, but then they would diverge.
Yeah.
I think there's a certain, and so in that, do you imagine that the second entity would be aware that they are, derivative from something else? And is that important?
Like, would they know they've been backed up?
Yeah, would they walk around saying that I am a really good copy of, the guy that used to be Joe Schmo? But, so little questions of, do they have that awareness? Is it important? And your question, well, what happened with the original body? If it were destroyed, then that new entity logically would see itself as continuous with the prior being, I think. But, you're right, if the model A is still there, and now there's model B, unless they're somehow linked, which, in other discussions, we've imagined that maybe the future entities are linked. That you can make B, C, D, and E, and all have experiences, which for Dr. White, he would then be able to read all the books on his bedside table. And so I think when we try to imagine how things might be, that idea of having multiple individuals that are still part of a single organism, that's more far-fetched, but I think worth considering.
In the talk you mentioned like the ethics and the morality of clones and like what kind of human rights they would have if cloning humans was a thing. And I think in that respect, even if someone knew, even if I knew that I was a clone of someone else, even if I could accept that fact, it would still be difficult to accept that this, the copy or the backed up version has less rights or less autonomy than the original, because if it is a copy, then that means they have the same views of their independence and their autonomy. So I think the only way that it could be, I agree with what Abrar said, that the second two things existed at the same time, they would be similar they would be the same only in that first instant. And then all their experiences after that would change who they were. So I think the only way they would still be the same person, like what Dr. Solis talked about in one lecture about the multi-threading, where everyone comes back and shares their experiences from their different lives. I think the only way that would be possible if there was some kind of shared consciousness across all of these people or clones. Because I think a large part of being in your head is the fact that you can have conversations with yourself. So even if you do have different parts of your personality, they're always linked. So it's always seen as I. It's never you and I, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the interesting question of would a conversation be necessary, or would the shared thought space be enough that you don't actually have to verbalize? It's just the shared understanding. And I think that as we try to push our imaginations to the limit, you know, especially based on that super high-speed computing power that's, you know, 100 million more times more powerful than now. You know, and trying to imagine what that might mean, especially plugged into the brain and augmented. You know, and so again, I think that, you know, maybe one of the key messages is to be open to these possibilities and recognizing that until we get closer to the time, we're not going to know exactly what we're going to be dealing with. But as you were speaking, I was just thinking, well, you know, to what degree are we one with our parents? You know, I mean, you could sort of put it one way that, you know, where it's part of a great chain of DNA, and you happen to be, you know, at the confluence of these two lines that have been, you know, that are going on for 1,000 generations. You know, and depending on what you mean by language, you could say that you are very much like your parents, or you're in some ways a representation of them. You know, you're not the same person. You know, but then I wonder if we were able to duplicate ourselves, is the original end up being like a parent, and the new things are like offspring? And so they're bound by a sense of shared identity, but individuality. And then I also shared your gut reaction, you know, almost, well, of course, any entity that is free thinking and intelligent is going to have the right to not be you know, abused in some way. You know, and then I wonder, is that the sum total of our consumption of science fiction, which always sends the message that, you know, all entities have rights? So any others, you know, when you imagine these second beings that are created, do you think that they obviously would have the full rights of people, or might they be slightly diminished rights? All right, any other points from that first talk that jumped out at you we should discuss? Okay, I'll go on then. So then he ended that first one with the letter he's imagining getting early in 2045, where he's invited to come upload his body. And I recognized, I did the math, and in 2045 I turned 80. You know, exactly the time, exactly the year that I'm expected to die. So I'm looking forward to my letter. You know, so again, into the slides of the next talk. Again, this is the singularity one. And again, I'm going to want to ask you before the end, you know, the question that he's working towards. He says, you know, do you believe in the singularity, or do you believe it's going to happen? So we'll head at least towards that question. Okay, so then he shares more questions and answers. So again, if any of these jump out at you, we can start a discussion at any time. I was struck when you pulled this out, that the Martin Luther King in the 60s, I presume, says, our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided men. And I know that, you know, as I was, you know, in the 1980s, as I'm going from high school into my university career and figuring out, you know, well, what should one do with one's life, it was very much an idea like this that made me think that maybe ethics or bioethics or health ethics was a good field, because it was easy to say that our technological capabilities were flying forward at an unbelievable speed, but our ethics, our sense of what to do with such things and by what rules, don't seem to be growing at an exponential speed. So I know that, at least to some degree, I had this type of thought in going into this field some 30 years ago. And so here are his you know, questions, and then tentative answers to be considered. That technology will fix everything. You know, and so I think that is a big part of the hope that that the incredibly increased computing power will increase our ability to understand complex things, and then to generate, I guess, the wealth, the goods and services that are going to enable us all to be able to survive. But, then the next thought, but politics and practicality still rule. And so I think it's been a theme of the course, to what degree will justice rule over how these future goods are distributed? And I think, all of you at some point expressed some question about that. How important is fairness of distribution? Is it a huge mistake to say that there won't be human progress unless everybody can step forward equally? That the history of progress has pretty much by definition being that it applies only to a few people, and that if it succeeds as a technology, it will eventually spread. And then when you look around the world at politics and practicality and those questions of, does all of this increased power in the hands of people who are still politically the same as they've always been, is that going to be a problem? The second thing, he says that big data is the solution. And then the thing, except information overwhelms and separates us. So he does, in one of those lectures, share a lamentation that he is overwhelmed. He has too many things to take care of, too many books to read, too many games he's bought that he hasn't yet begun to play, and he's trying to think, well, where is all the time going to come to consume all of this stuff? And that's, so he says, while it's absolutely great to have information at our fingertips, to sit on the couch at home and a question pops in, you don't have to wait to go to the library, you can get the answers right away. But at the same time, do we become less engaged with each other as we're spending all of our time looking at the big data? So, next one, that we will harness new technology to do amazing things. So I think all of us agree, and one of the things this course does a great job of is giving you specifics on some of the great things that are happening and where we're going, and why artificial intelligence and the possibility of technology merging with human beings is not a fantasy, that we are very much in the early days of the science and technology that will enable this. But then that thing that we don't necessarily seem to be getting exponentially wiser or kinder. Which I think is debatable. You could make an argument that we are a lot, we, the sort of the grand royal we of people in our general society at this general time. One can make an argument that we are a lot wiser than we used to be. And I would just say what seems pretty obvious about tolerance, despite things that are heard in the news, I think that we around here are incredibly open and tolerant to the other of all types, probably far more so than 100 years ago, and probably far more so than 50 years ago. And so I'm not sure I agree that we're not getting a little bit wiser and kinder, which I think is some version of internalizing the idea that human beings are pretty much similar to each other. Again, I sometimes worry that I'm, that I've been insulated from the evils of the world, that I feel this way, that I do maybe have more hope in humanity, and think that the average person in the street knows in their heart of hearts that human beings are basically similar, and that, so I don't know. Any opinions out there as to whether we're getting wiser or kinder? And if we're not, should we slow down the technology to let our wisdom and kindness catch up?
I don't know if we're actually getting wiser or kinder or not, but I think the access to so many different opinions and like basically everyone being able to voice their opinions on large scales now is letting us see all of the different perspectives that there are. And personally, I was surprised that there are people who aren't that wise and kind as I would like to think, because I also like to have the optimistic view that you have, that the average person on the street, you know, is a nice person at their core. But I think having access to you know, the internet kind of showed me that there are people who might not be as wise or kind as I thought, but then at the same time you can also see that there's so many people that are. So I don't know, I think maybe we are as a society just putting more emphasis on growing in that direction as well, rather than just, you know, scientific advancement. We're also trying to, like, the newer generations are trying to push towards not just improving our technology, but also improving society and how we view humanity.
Yeah, and it seems to me quite a bit of effort in understanding how the ways of the past have brought us to where we are and how we relate to each other. You know, and I think no question that the internet, you know, the ability for all of us to communicate en masse in this relatively unfiltered way, it was very new for us. You know, I think we're still trying to figure out in what ways it might contribute to our getting wiser or kinder. You know, and is it possible that it's having the opposite effect? That, you know, because I think the thing about kindness in particular is that when people decide not to be kind, it often isn't a decision in and of itself. It's a response to a perception that the person they're dealing with has been unkind or is untrustworthy. And so a lot of this will, you know, go back to, you know, the thing on my mind, which is trust. You know, in our society, where do we get it? Who do we feel that we can trust? And what do we know based on recent history about how trust gets built up and how trust gets destroyed? And so much of this depends on who can you really trust. And if we have this higher level of trust, I think there's a much better chance that kindness will emerge and that wisdom will follow. A few more slides yet. You know, we're all about fixing hunger, poverty, and war. But first we have to improve life in California. So I presume this is a slide of somewhere in California, suggesting that while concern about poverty and oppression and misery around the world are commendable and understandable, that we shouldn't forget our so-called own backyard. Again, that's that slide. You know, these are, you know, his other observations. He says, I'm doing this for you, and here's where he shares, you know, a bit of a concern. He describes his experience at Singularity University, where he spent, was it a week or a couple weeks? And,
Yeah, I think
you know,
probably a week.
yeah. You know, and I think he certainly said that it was a place where people with similar hopes for the future come together. You know, he wasn't sure that he belonged among them as you know, the proverbial true believer that this is coming. You know, and then he shared the skepticism that, you know, are some of these people really not true believers, or are they seeing this as an opportunity to sell things? You know, I guess just he shared the experience that, you know, you meet people that say the singularity is great, will you buy my book? You know, and just a little concern about, you know, is that part of what's motivating people to participate? You know, or, you know, as the highest hopes, is it actually a reasonable coming together of people who see the future fairly clearly and think appropriately that it's time to start thinking about and preparing for what we see as a possibly very different future. And so I think he leaves that a little bit unanswered, that hopefully the Singularity University evolves into something helpful, that by spending time looking at these questions, identifying these questions, it helps usher in the future with eyes more open than they would otherwise be. He says that among some of the people there seems to be the attitude that in order to improve or maximize human life, we just need to change a few little details and then the world will be much better. Just a couple little things. And then throws in the ironic statement, like your brain and your DNA, your thoughts and the essence of your being. We just have to change those a bit and then everything will be fine. Suggesting that is too tall an order. And I think, in some ways, what the concepts that I've tried to introduce, like the slippery slope, that we can imagine changes that might be made for the better, but we probably would be well served to think, what might those things lead to down the road? And even now, when you think about your DNA and your brain, and in the back of your mind, you think, well, what might people do with this? If I'm curious about my ancestry and send my cheek scraping to an ancestry place, they are going to have my DNA, which they say they're just going to use for this, but in the back of your mind, you worry, well, who else might see that information or purchase that information, and what might they do with it? So then in his last few slides, you can't wait for the future, are we there yet? Suggests that these may be the good old days, So I have shared with you some of my own concerns, but I don't think I'm gonna bring you down right now with my latest fears of where things might be leading. So just, these are the last few slides. He gives a couple of scenarios of what you might do, and this is what he likes to see. But maybe we'll pause here, as he did, to give you guys just a chance to reflect or share your reflections at this point in the course of, well, what do you think of this singularity discussion? This idea that whether it's a merger or an evolution between technology and human beings, I think we accept that we can't precisely define what the singularity would be, or I think be too stringent. But we know that in general, it's meant to refer to that time when technology becomes just much more significant. It makes it able to fundamentally change the way we live or the way we see ourselves. So with that, we'll maybe go around the room to just invite you to share what you're thinking so far about why this might be important to you. What do you think of the singularity? Do you consider yourself someone who believes it will come inevitably to some degree, or possibly, or how are you thinking about it? So we always start there, so maybe we'll start on this side.
Yeah, I believe in the singularity. I believe it's inevitable.
Why?
Just like taking into consideration like Moore's law and like the human nature to just keep on advancing.
So you think that it's computing power's exponential growth that will continue, and that with a few more rungs up the ladder that we will be sharing the planet with some kind of super intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, we might like destroy ourselves along the way, we might rebuild, and I think like the inevitability.
So is that now if that's your concern, is it a remote concern, or is it a concern that's big enough that suggests maybe we should slow down our progress if possible in order to keep ourselves safer.
Yeah, like these things happen like spontaneously sometimes, right? And suddenly it's like we're attacking each other. I don't know. It's hard to say. Should we slow down? Probably not.
We'll save you for the end, sir. Rashida?
I agree with Simon. I think it is inevitable. Because I think the nature of the kind of revolution in human history that we're talking about when we talk about singularity, like how you mentioned the Industrial Revolution and things like that, I think the nature of it is that no one really sees it coming, and then it just changes the world. And there's no way of going back, but most of the time you don't want to go back, right? Like most of the revolutions we've had have improved, society and individual human lives. So, like specifically about the transcending biology thing, I'm really glad I watched that lecture, because I was always like part of the camp of people that thought, I didn't want my consciousness to be uploaded to like a different substrate, because, there's this human experience that requires a body and that requires like, I don't know, like human touch and stuff, which is something that people always talk about in these kind of topics. But like after listening to that talk and just thinking about how replaceable everything is and how much our bodies can actually hold us back with all of those like downsides to having like a really fragile flesh body, I think that maybe transcending biology would actually end up improving our lives and improving society. So I do think the singularity is inevitable, and I think it might turn out really cool.
And again, I guess it might be too much to hope for to think you figured out how reproduction will work after that, or?
I guess I haven't really considered reproduction. I think a lot of the reasons that people have kids is to have that sense of continuity, like, I might die, but I'm giving something to the world. I'm like kind of carrying on my legacy.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, if death isn't like an issue, like if your body doesn't have a time limit, right? Then maybe reproduction isn't something that's high on your priority list.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, and the actual elimination of the necessity of death might well be something that ends up being a rupture, meaning a fundamental change in the way humans live their lives and look at themselves. And then when we try to imagine all of the challenges, such as the inevitable overpopulation, maybe we're thinking too narrowly. Okay.
All right, so I don't think that in the basic sense that we talk about the singularity where, there's going to be this mass intelligence explosion is going to be very realistic in our lifetime. By 2045, I think there might be remnants of singularity and increasing technological advancements, such as what Ishida talked about, but like the mass aggregate computational power that we all assume is going to continue to increase by the year 2045. I don't think that's going to be a thing, and I think there are a few big reasons for this. The primary reason is there's many competing interests in companies that use this computing power for different things. We have China and the U.S. competing for the biggest supercomputers. They fight back and forth every few years, but then on top of that we have all these independent parties, all these companies that use these computing power to run their own services and stuff. But then we have there's things in American politics, a lot of these politicians that talk about them wanting to break up these unicorns, these big companies, like namely Facebook, Apple, Google, right? So like if you're going to limit the rate at which the most impactful companies, the most impactful like sources of the computing power is growing, I feel like it's not possible for us to realistically reach the target of having computing power that's past the aggregate computing power of the human race by 2045. But And also in a similar sense, I don't think there's any way, if we even have like that much computing power spread out throughout the world, to actually use it effectively. We might have all this computing power, right? So it's like we have a bunch of computers and they're not connected to anything, right? We have all these supercomputers and they're usually offline. They're running a bunch of simulations for some stuff, or they're doing calculations for like the Department of Defense or anything, right? We have all this power, but it's being used for very specific tasks. And if we just have all this power, it's not connected. I don't think it's going to lead to anything that we know, that we think that the singularity is going to resemble in the year 2045. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay. So, I mean, good reasons, but it sounds like you think that Moore's law and the curve will be disrupted somehow.
I hold a somewhat similar opinion. I do think this technological singularity will come for sure, like it's inevitable. Just the advancement of, I guess, human science. At some point we'll probably hit there, but perhaps not like an overnight kind of thing. Like if we do have that breakthrough moment where we, like I don't think there'll be necessarily one breakthrough moment where we'll have suddenly a super AI being built. But I think rather it'll be like a combination of, you'll see it coming like as it comes. And then the other thing is that just because we have the ability to do, a ton of calculations and computations doesn't necessarily mean we can capitalize on the data that we learn out of it. Because at the end of the day, what we have is data, but we need to translate the data into something that is applicable to real life. So for example, I guess one example could be that we have this supercomputer, big AI that's able to process the entire human genome and all the proteins, figure out all the pathways, how they all interrelate. And then they want to say, okay, let's create, a super mouse or something. The mouse will still take time to grow, and the mouse will still be affected by how humans are able to implement the data that's being given, right? So I think that the bottleneck to technology is our own technology. We don't have the technology to supplant, I guess, the amount of computational power we currently have. I guess maybe, so I think when we talk about these kind of things with the singularity, I think we're thinking like in a further future than perhaps what's presented in 2050.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a lot of interesting ideas about how does this begin? So even if the computers reach that point, does it somehow have the ability to impact the world, within months or years?
Mhm.
Or are we talking decades or centuries? I think there's probably a good argument to be made that the small group that maybe initially experiences what might be a singularity, that it could take a very long time for that to spread around the world.
I think just like everyone before me has said, I think singularity is gonna happen for sure, but I just don't know to like what extent it's gonna happen. So I'm not really optimistic. I don't know. Like people complain, oh, technology sucks and all that stuff. But if they were given the chance, they wouldn't go back. But I don't know to what extent they would want to further advance to like how we were talking about transcendence and things like that. I think that's crazy. I don't know. Me personally, I don't know, but.
Yeah, well, I think we may indeed be bound by our biology, and this. I mean, a lot of the question is built on this, I'd say, somewhat, Western historical conception of the duality of mind and body, that they're two separate things. And I think based on that idea that somehow our mind, probably contained in our brain, could somehow be separated from the body remains a big if. And I think that's the fundamental question. Is it even reasonable to think that existence beyond the intimate connection with our traditional bodies is possible? Which I mean, I think most of his talk is a meditation on that question. And from what I hear from you guys so far, you think, at least to some degree, yes, that we will achieve some sort of liberation from the limits of biology, but it's hard to say how far.
Yeah, like what Gagan and like Caleb and them said, my opinion's like the same as well. Like, I think the singularity would happen, but it's just like I don't really know like how it would get there, because like we would have to have like this breakthrough moment, I guess, as like society, where like everyone's like on the same page, I guess, about the idea, so then we could like and like advance to the like next level, I guess. But it's like kind of hard because like there's like people like even in like medicine or whatever, like there's so many like technologies and stuff now and like new treatments and stuff, but then like some people still rather go like natural ways or like holistic ways and stuff like that, even though there's like these technologies for like treatments and stuff, right? So it's like if even like now like people can't all be on the same page, like I don't know how everyone's gonna be on the same page for like technology and like stuff like that, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's, I mean, I think you're expressing some reasonably and, you know, realistic ideas of how is this going to unfold, how is it going to earn people's confidence, what will people need to see to make them think that it's a good idea for them. Because if the recent past is any indication, there will always be a bunch of naysayers who actively reject the current trends. You know, and so you know, I think you're right in predicting that those ideas aren't likely to go away. You know, there will probably be the naysayers, the ones who say that this new way of being human or new way of existing isn't for me. I'll take the old-fashioned way thinking. So I think part of our imagining is a pluralistic world. You know, that this is going to have to be certainly not the only way of being. I mean, we may not, it may be a little bit premature to get into the nuts and bolts of how specifically this might work. I think we know that a lot of it isn't predictable, especially the part that the super intelligent computers will hopefully reflect on and be wise about. So, yes, good.
I'm a little skeptical, I guess I would say, in terms of the whole concept about the singularity. I don't think it's gonna occur anytime soon, but with that being said, I also don't think that it's appropriate to say that it's inevitable either. Like, the entire concept of the singularity I find to be a little bit extreme. Often when, you know, the concept is provided, people try to back it up using Moore's law. But I don't think Moore's law in and of itself should be causal evidence, because Moore's law really just refers to computational power, and I feel like at one point it's going to hit a plateau. So in the future and in the long run of things, like, we're definitely, I wouldn't say that we're even close to hitting the singularity and all these grand promises that it seems to provide. So the chances are that there will be some sort of rupture in Moore's law, and like, we're not necessarily going to see the same trends over time. I guess with regards to certain concepts like transcending biology, I just think it's too complex, at least at this stage. Maybe after a significant amount of time, we could understand enough concepts to perhaps reach that state, but I don't know if humanity is going to be wiped out by that or not. And also, if you look at other aspects like Marcus Hutter talking about self-sufficiency of computers, personally, I can't see it happening. I'm not denying it outright. But with that being said, like, there are certain aspects of technological advancement that I do believe in that we might not even fathom to be possibilities that might come relatively soon.
Well, that's well put. I mean, I know I have trouble getting my mind around technology that's going to fully replace biology. So I think when I go through it in my own head, how might this work, I think I would tend towards a synthesis that in the end that the biological brain at least, you know, and all the stuff that's going on with it, I could imagine it being attached to other body parts or things that become body parts. But, and I guess I have this suspicion that there's a great deal going on in the brain, and that even and that our estimation of the number of functions per second or something is that we're vastly underestimating the complexity of it. Yeah, so I think that's a good expression of practical skepticism, leaving the door open.
Alright. I think that the singularity is going to be an eventuality for sure, but not in the way people would think. Honestly, I think that true AI, which is presented in science fiction, things that replicate the human mind exactly, will not be possible for a very, very, very long time. However, at the same time, the singularity is a point where technological advancement is exponential. I think we may be already slowly getting onto that route with the methods of enhancing human intelligence. Because honestly, machine learning, AI, biology, these are all tools for people to help advance themselves even further. Already we're seeing machine learning helping to process immense amounts of data, helping to show new correlations, data, insights that people can use to continually innovate and do whatever they want with data. So I think following this trend and assuming we don't all die somehow due to some sort of calamity, eventually we're going to reach a point where we have the tools to give ourselves exponential advancements. Although the chances that we take up those said tools is questionable to human nature and whatever. So eventually, probably.
All right, well, that's a good skilled provisional hope. Wouldn't call it sitting on the fence, but the idea that it might take a lot longer.
So I wouldn't dismiss the idea of the singularity altogether. Rather, I understand there's a lot of different factors that affect how our timeline moves forward from this point on and which timeline, I guess, we go down. But like if you think about even 5,000 years ago, nobody thought we were going to be living in a global community today. So who's to really say that in another 5,000 years from now, we don't all just live in this universal state of consciousness, no shared collective consciousness. But I also think that it's just difficult for us to think about right now with the technology that we have, because it's difficult to think about the future without the technology of the future. So I also believe that the singularity doesn't really need to manifest in a predictable way, especially not how we can predict it currently, again, without the technology that there may be in the future. So I think if we do manage to escape extinction as a species, that it would probably be pretty inevitable.
So I mean, it's interesting that a bunch of you have thrown in the if we can avoid catastrophe, which again to me I mentioned the slippery slope, and I also mentioned that thing called the precautionary principle. To what degree should we be worried about things that don't seem very likely to go wrong, but if they do, it's total catastrophe. And so one of the things that, if it is in fact inevitable that we humans, are greedy and selfish, and that can't be changed, and that it's inevitable that we will use all the power at our disposal to vanquish those who we fear, then it could be that the creation of these advanced technologies inevitably leads to the destruction of our species or our planet. I don't know what the appropriate response to that is. Is it just sort of the Luddite? Well, don't ever get too technologically advanced if your goal is to stay alive on the planet. And then you hear, there's some skeptics out there about, well, why haven't we found alien life? Some people say we haven't found alien life, and we've been looking really hard for 50 years. People hypothesize that, well, it's just inevitable that when biological beings get powerful enough to be detected on other worlds, they all blow themselves away. Anyway, it's a good sense of caution.
On the topic of catastrophe,
I think that the singularity is probably going to happen too. I think we are in a time right now of a lot of exponential change with technology. Like even if you think about our lifetimes, how much our cell phones have changed, how hard it is for our parents to even understand what the computer can do sometimes. So definitely with exponential change, it's definitely happening. I think where my skepticism also comes in is the fear of it, not so much with the AI, but who's going to be using the AI. As I think Dr. Zaim and a bunch of other classmates said, technology is a tool that we use. So, you know, with the catastrophes and everything, climate change, our ecosystem kind of falling apart. I'm scared that technology isn't going to be used in a way that's going to sustain us for the long term. Because again, we are a long-lived species. We don't understand the effects of our actions until maybe a generation afterwards. And by then, the change might not be reversible.
Yeah, well, that's maybe where we bring in the, those really intelligent advanced computers that are going to think up solutions that we haven't yet, or enable the technology that's going to lead to solutions because of efficiencies or new ways of producing things. I mean, when you think about what do we humans really need, we need some food, some liquid, and maybe some shelter. And that you can think that if we tackle those issues first, maybe it's a stepping stone to something else. I mean, I know for me, his slides where he says, well, on the one hand we've got this good thing, but on the other hand we have this bad thing. I don't, I'm persuaded that human beings on the grand political scale, aren't yet going to behave rationally or justly or with excessive amounts of mercy. I worry that they still are motivated mainly by fear of the other, and that there's this big circle of, well, if we are not strong, they're going to come attack us, so we've got to be strong. Meanwhile, the other sides are saying, well, they're getting strong, so we better get strong, and you just get this inevitable race. When I do meditate on the incredible technologies like a master computer that drove all of our cars or our entire transportation system with utmost efficiency and minimal danger, what a great thing that would be. But I worry that the very same technology that would enable that, when I think about what might some misguided people, what sort of weapons might they want to build using that very same technology. And here I fear trying not to be too influenced by science fiction, but I fear a future with millions of drones in the sky, again, caused by this tragic cycle of fear where one party felt they had to build the protective drones only because they thought their opponents were, and it's the same technology that's used for incredible good and potentially incredible destruction. So I think in some ways, as somebody who's maybe 2/3 of the way through a career in ethics, where you hope to make some impact by getting people to think a little bit more deeply about things and to make possibly better decisions, I'm not sure that I'm more confident now that we humans are going to make good, sound decisions of what to do with the technology. At the same time, I think we have to consider another couple of questions, like, do we have any control over progress at all, anyway? Or is it already on a self-perpetuating type of line? So, I think to summarize it, it sounds like you have a healthy knowledge of what the singularity might be. I would say an accurate perception that it's probably not all of a sudden, that it starts and then grows over time in a way that's hard to be predictable. I heard a fair bit of optimism that there's a chance that this will bring good. The last thing I would add is that I am certain that the technologies, the medical technologies that we've developed, are really going to help us avoid suffering. avoid the biological suffering that is what makes us question whether these bodies are up to the task at all. If you look at the incredible progress of medicine over the last century, it's basically taking the diseases and injuries that would have mowed us down and giving a cure. And so right now you can, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with your body that can be fixed. And I would think that in 10 years or 100 years, the list of things that we can fix is going to be longer and longer and longer. And maybe the future of medicine will really be just focused on the elimination of all of the ways our biological body lets us down. The mental thing in the brain is a different question.
One of the things that struck me as you all opined on this is that none of you seem to be suggesting that you could shift the potential toward more positive outcome. And I think that you are more empowered, you have more agency than you think there. I mean, just take you back to, so September 7th, 2001, I gave a talk in Banff. It was a session called Smart, Sexy, Healthy. And some of the things that I talked about on September 7th, 2001 was the fact that Air Canada at that time was going to be the first airline with like free Wi-Fi in the air within, a few months from that. And a bunch of other things. And boy, did the world change just a few days later, September 11th. But if you think about, the potential to you yourself change something, on September 11th, Premier Klein gave a talk at a specific podium at the Ledge. And I was going to be on TV talking about, building collapses and stuff. So the TV station told me that when Klein finished, I should go up to the very same podium and start talking about it. It's exactly what I did. So, I mean, you can't really detect that. It's not the same video with Klein and Solas. But in that sense, that's not just me. That's any one of you could have been in a situation like that. There will be surprises in the future, and some of those big surprises will be like wild cards that influence a lot of what then happens. But having taken this course, having spent some time thinking about these things, you're a little bit more prepared maybe to actually nudge the future in the right direction. But another thing that's kind of cool is being off the US map. We're the only major Canadian city off the US map. So if something terrible happens, we're not very much of a target. It was funny listening to Klein on September 11th about what we were going to protect and what action we were taking. We're going to protect the oil fields and so on. But actually nobody really thought that they were like the next target, but it was all that he could think of or what it would protect. And then maybe there's something else interesting. A lot of you have pets that you feel a special bond with, right? And now you've been talking about drones in the air, right? And the drones have a vision system probably much superior to any camera you've ever used. Even better when Osmer lectures about these cameras that security and police forces have. It's even better than that. It's a very good camera. So at Singularity University, I met the guy who basically developed the U.S. military's drone camera system. He was the main technology advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I got to know him fairly well. It's interesting being in that position. You're kind of a target. So like he's on Facebook, but not quite as much as I am, because, you know, the military forces elsewhere in the world are very interested in this guy. But when you sit and talk to him, what does he like to talk about? He's very devoted to his dog. His dog has various problems, and you know that's a thing for him. It's a valid conversation point for this guy more than it is for most people. And then a couple of years ago, he had a serious heart attack, and he survived. So he's grateful to the medical care establishment because he was sort of brought back from near death. So on the one hand, he is the person kind of responsible for the original vision systems that a lot of the U.S. military drones have. But he's a very cool guy, a warm human person, you know. So that kind of gives you hope. First of all, being human is great, but we could imagine that a lot of things we currently accept as limits could be improved. And that's probably what we're looking at, that at some point it'll be obvious that, you know, that these limits that we've all accepted just won't so much be there, and things will be better, easier than they are now. And if there's one sense in which I don't agree with Jonathan White, I think he's been a wonderful asset to this course. It's kind of funny to think about that first lecture that he gave in 2011. He had prepared so much for this, he had so much invested in it, that the fact that I had this practice at that time of introducing the lecturer with a little talk of my own, it was so not working for him, because every moment I spoke took time away from him, and he had so much invested in this. And then he started with a song, the Future Soon, and it was like an excellent beginning, but in terms of putting video out there for the world, it wasn't working for me because we didn't own the rights to this copyrighted song. The video starts after the song. So the reason it's such a rough beginning is that that wasn't the way the lecture began. It's just when I stripped off the song, that's what we were left with. And then if you think of the Gartner hype curve, he has gone through every point in that sort of in front of this class, right? Been at some points very hopeful about tech stuff, and then very disillusioned, and so on. So it's good for us to also be aware of those various vantage points. But I think that I would like you all to feel more empowered than you do right now today. It really is possible to change the world more than I think you personally think it is at the moment. And so maybe 10 years from now, your answers to these same questions would contain more of a sense of how you and others could maybe work toward a more positive outcome. Because that really is possible. If you think about what were the limits on one person changing the world before, a lot of it was, communication. Like the person with the best idea about fixing everything in the world, it would probably live very far from, the people who had access to any sort of electrical communication, let's say, printing books or whatever. Yeah, so that was the limit before. That's not really there now. So you can communicate instantly with people around the world, and you'd say, well, yeah, there's a lot of competition. It's not as great as you might think, because like 99.99999% of people think that they can't really change things, so they're not trying, right? So the number of people in any one important area really trying to fix things is quite limited. So you really can change things, and you're more likely to be able to survive and to change things if something really bad happens by living where you are living now, because we're sort of off the radar for most people who would be doing the targeting in any big war.
Unless the missile that was going elsewhere fell short.
Yes, some terrible mistake in targeting. Otherwise, yeah.
But I think that's a very valuable lesson, that there is, in all of our discussions of this, an air of inevitability.
Yeah.
You know, when you talk about justice and big data and big corporations, true, they are very powerful, but each one of you is in fact empowered to first of all, think about this issue, and second of all, think about opportunities you might have to do something about it, whether that's raise awareness or bring some of the sensibilities of this course to other parts of our culture where they're presumably going to emerge. So again, I think the whole goal of this is to give you guys some tools to think about all this stuff, and we're going to trust that you're going to be able to use those tools helpfully in the future as we're in our nursing homes, or maybe not.
So on Thursday, this is the only teaching session we have where there will never be a published video. We'll probably capture video, but we're not going to put it up anywhere. So it's momentarily shocking to think of something like anthrax that can harm a large number of people. But it's sort of the quintessential bioterrorism threat. The US military service people were vaccinated against anthrax as a routine for a long period of time. It was a very painful injection, so on. And it's a part of history, it's a part of like conspiracy theories, because part of what he's talking about, we really don't know who sent those anthrax letters for sure. We know this one person who was surveilled by the FBI. He was working in this anthrax facility, and there were picnic tables outside. So, like, the FBI sat there and watched him for weeks and weeks. And then he apparently killed himself, but we don't really know. So it's kind of intriguing and very different from the rest of this course. So I think it just happens that that's the last lecture before you guys actually start giving your talks. But I think you'll enjoy it, and it is worthwhile to think about the idea of fashionable things, fads, right? Because in evil, there can also be fads, right? So that's what that was. It was sort of, if you wanted to harm people, anthrax was the fashionable way to do it at that moment in 2001. Okay, well, thank you all for taking part in today's session.